Well, hello. This is our second and final video of the week. I think I can squeeze everything into two videos. Last video, I kind of introduced this new period of Greek history that we're studying, so-called classical period. And in this video, I want to focus on war because this week's readings, the Western World readings and the Thucydides reading, are both dominated by war. You can't understand classical Greece without these two wars in particular. I'm talking about the Persian War, or wars, because really it's two different wars, and the Peloponnesian War. That is Peloponnesian, Peloponnesian. As always with these videos, I would recommend that you keep your reading close at hand for spelling purposes, map purposes, and others. So I thought this would be a good time to talk a little bit about the best way to study any of the wars that we're going to discuss in this course, and there will be a number of them, but we haven't really studied a war as of yet. So some of you may really love military history. This may be when history really comes alive for you and you love the battles and the formations and the generals and the weaponry and all that. For others of you, studying wars may be simply overwhelming, if not mind-numbing. So I want to suggest that with any war that we study in this class, there are really three things you want to pay attention to, three C's. Okay. The first is causes. And I put causes in the plural because normally there will be more than one cause at play. Why did this war get started? What were the different factors that contributed to the breakout of the war? The second C is very straightforward, combatants, right? So who is fighting whom? Obviously, that's pretty basic knowledge without which you can't really understand anything about the war. And then finally, the third C is consequences. Okay. How did this war make a difference? How did it make a difference politically, certainly, but also culturally, socially, maybe even religiously? And when you're looking at consequences, you need to look at both short-term consequences, immediate consequences, right? So how did things change straight away? But then also long-term consequences. So what are some developments that might take place decades after the war that are still in some way connected to that war, fallout from that war? So those are the three C's. Now, occasionally we will want you to know the name of a significant battle. Okay, for instance, the Battle of Marathon. But let the study guide help you there. The study guide is going to let you know if there are any battles that you need to know, if there are any particular generals or leaders that you need to be familiar with. All right, so I'm going to start with the earliest of the two wars, and that is the Persian War, or Persian Wars. Okay. You're going to read a little bit in Western World about Persia. Suffice it to say for now that Persia had put together possibly the most impressive empire that the world had ever known at this point in time. Okay. So this is, in a very real sense, a kind of David and Goliath story, with Persia, of course, playing the part of Goliath, and the Greeks playing the part of David. And if you've gone to Sunday school, you know how that story turns out, and that's exactly how this war turns out as well. So how does it start? Well, it begins because Persia is trying to increase its extent by moving to the west. And around 546, it takes over, it conquers the western coast of Asia Minor. Now you'll remember that this is an area that the Greeks had been colonizing for some time. So there's a number of Greek colonies that are now subjugated to the Persian Empire. Well, not all of these Greek polis are very happy about this. And there's one polis in particular, Miletus, which you can find on your map. It's southwestern Asia Minor. Okay. The polis of Miletus revolts against Persian rule and attempts to set up some sort of democratic constitution. And they requested the help of the Athenians. They wanted Athens to help them out against the Persians. Now, Athens complies, but they make a kind of token gesture. They send about 20 ships, which is not enough to make a difference in the war, but it is enough to really irritate the Persians. Okay? And at the very least, we can say that this is going to give the Persians a pretext, an excuse to go across the Aegean Sea and make a play for Greece. It may well be that Persia was already eyeing Greece. This gives them a reason to actually launch a full-scale invasion, which happens in the year 490. So 490 is when the Persian War begins. One thing is very important to remember, especially given the next war that we'll talk about, is that in the Persian War, all the Greek polis put aside their differences and they band together to fight against the Persians. And this includes, of course, Athens and Sparta. So in the Persian War, Athens and Sparta are helping each other, fighting side by side. I mentioned a moment ago that there will occasionally be some battles that we want you to know that you might be quizzed over. And the Battle of Marathon is one of those landmark battles. So that's in the year 490. You'll be reading about the Battle of Marathon. So there's fighting in 490, and the Greeks, they come out victorious. And the Persians have to sort of go back home with their tail between their legs, and it takes them about 10 years to regroup and launch another invasion. So this is why sometimes I'll refer to this as the Persian Wars in the plural, because we're really talking about two different wars fought about 10 years apart. It's possible to also see them as part of the same war. Either perspective, I think, has some validity. So this brings us to the Great Persian Invasion of 480, led by the Persian king Xerxes, X-E-R-X-E-S. Now, the Persians are able to score some important victories, perhaps most notably the victory at Thermopylae, T-H-E-R-M-O-P-Y-L-A-E, Thermopylae. It's the Hot Gates. This is a very famous battle several years back. The movie 300 was very loosely based on this battle. And it's a marquee victory for the Persians, but it's not enough, because the Greeks, again, are going to band together. They are going to win a couple of really decisive victories, both on land and at sea. And by the year 479, once again, the overwhelming favorites, the Persians, are sent home packing by the underdog Greeks. So that's in 479. At that time, the Persian War is over. Now, it is important to mention that we know that because we have hindsight that makes us see 2020. But the Greeks, of course, at the time weren't sure. They thought maybe the Persians would come back again. And that's important for understanding what happens next in the story, particularly the formation of the Delian League, which you'll read about. I'm not going to say anything else about right now. What I will say is that this is really a turning point in Greek history, the year 479. For a lot of historians, this marks the beginning of the classical period. Certainly, without question, it ushers in a kind of golden age for Athens in particular. Athens, which becomes a great sort of military leader among the Greek police at this time, but also, without question, Athens becomes the great cultural center of Greece at this time. So this period, from the end of the Persian War in 479 to the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War in 431, this is the golden age of Athens. This is the age in which Athenian democracy reaches its full flowering. This is the age in which some of the greatest works of Athenian art and drama and architecture are produced. Okay, so the middle decades of the 5th century BC, this is the Athenian golden age. And we'll be coming back to this in the next couple of weeks, because much of the art we'll be looking at, much of the drama we'll be reading comes from that period. But that's not what this video is about. This video is about war. So we're going to move on to our second war, which is the Peloponnesian War. As I said, it begins in the year 431 BC. And I'm not going to sort of give you the answer on a silver platter here, but I am going to pose for you the question that you need to be able to answer, which is this: how can we see the Peloponnesian War as a kind of long-term consequence of the Persian War? Remember, I said a moment ago that when you're looking at the consequences of a war, don't just look at immediate consequences, but look at how a war will shape events decades down the road. And I think it is possible, and you need to be able to do this, to sort of get us from point A to point B. Point A being the end of the Persian War, point B being the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. What did these two wars have to do with one another? You need to be able to answer that. And I think if you read West in the World carefully, you'll be able to do that. Now, what I want to do in the remainder of this video is not narrate the Peloponnesian War, because you're going to get that in your textbook in West in the World. What I want to do is prime you for the other reading for this week, which is a selection of excerpts from Thucydides. Okay, Thucydides, Thucydides, Thucydides. Thucydides lived from about 460 to 400. And he's one of the great historians who has ever lived. Now, he's not the first. You read a little bit about the first in West in the World, and that is Herodotus. And Thucydides was very aware of Herodotus, and in many ways was trying to outdo Herodotus. But Thucydides, I think, is a more, from our point of view, more of a real modern historian than Herodotus. Herodotus, and by the way, that's Herodotus. Herodotus is very interesting, but a lot of times he brings in supernatural causes for certain events. He was narrating the Persian War, so we know much of what we know about the Persian War comes from Herodotus. But we have to be kind of careful, because he will attribute this or that event to the gods, for instance. And of course, most modern Western people today, whatever your religious beliefs may be, don't really consider that to be legitimate history. Okay? Thucydides is going to be different. And one of the things that I really want you to know about Thucydides is that Thucydides is looking for natural causes for historical events. Okay? And in this way, Thucydides is actually part of a broader movement of the time, a movement we might want to call naturalism, which is not necessarily atheism, okay? But naturalism is the attempt to try to explain things without resorting to supernatural explanations. And let me give you one example of a parallel figure who is, in some ways, in his own field, doing what Thucydides is doing in history. And this is someone that you were going to be reading about in West in the World this week. It's a name that most of you probably know. I'm sure that if you're in the medical field, I know a couple of you are, you know this name, and that is Hippocrates. Hippocrates, Hippocrates. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Hippocratic Oath that all doctors even today have to take. So Hippocrates was a physician. And what makes him such a remarkable figure was his attempt to try to explain disease purely in terms of natural causes. Okay? Every disease has a natural cause. This was the belief of Hippocrates. And in many ways, this is what Thucydides is saying in history. We can explain even the most complicated and dramatic historical events like wars. We can explain them in human terms. We don't have to say, well, Poseidon got angry about something and then, no, we can explain this in sort of human terms. So be aware of that. Now, in the very first little excerpt that we're reading from Thucydides, we learn some really important things. He tells us a little bit about how he goes about his business as a historian. So be looking at that. He tells us a little bit about sources. Okay, why should we trust Thucydides? Why should we consider his account of the war to be at all reliable or factual? He's going to address that. What do we do with all these speeches that are included in his history? And I'll say a little bit more about one of those speeches in just a moment, a speech by Pericles. Are we supposed to believe these speeches happened word for word, the way that Thucydides reports them, or what exactly? Well, he addresses that question as well. And at the end of that very first section, he also addresses what is perhaps the most important question of all, which is, why did he bother to sit down and write this history to begin with? Okay, and it's a big book. We're just reading a tiny excerpt. It's a 400-page book. Why write it? Is it something that would only interest relatives of veterans of the war, or what? Well, he makes it pretty clear that no. This is a book that will be valuable for anyone to read. He says at the end of that first section that his history is an everlasting possession. This is not a modest man we're talking about, okay? It's an everlasting possession, not a prized composition which is heard and forgotten. He's not writing entertainment. He's not just writing for the sake of widows, veterans, or for the veterans themselves who want to look back at the war. No, he's trying to say something about the human condition. Later on in Book 3, in the excerpt that we'll read, he says that human nature remains the same. Okay? Who we are as human beings is the same, regardless of time and place. And therefore, history, the study of historical events, is going to reveal a great deal about human nature, which is the same in the 5th century BC Greece as it is in 21st century America. And so he's saying, look, history can have the same kind of universal significance that literature can, right? We all think of literature as a kind of exploration of the human condition. And he's saying, look, history does this too. And of course, I probably don't need to remind you that this is the whole point of this class and of all of the humanities courses at Milligan. We are wrestling with that question. What does it mean to be human? Studying history is one way that we address that. Now, it's true that history never really repeats itself. I believe that. But I also like what Mark Twain said, or is supposed to have said, which is that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. In other words, there are these sort of recurring patterns in history. So if you study history, you are gaining valuable knowledge that can help us in the present. And I think we'll see some ways that Thucydides does that. Okay, now a brief word about the next three sections of the Thucydides reading. I just want to prepare you for those. The next section is one of the big ones, and it is the funeral oration of Pericles. Pericles. Gotta know Pericles. Pericles was the leading politician and general of 5th century Athens. And Thucydides is giving an account of a speech that he made at a special service that commemorated those who had fallen, the fallen Athenian soldiers up to that point in the war. And this is pretty early in the war. We're just in the first couple of years of the Peloponnesian War at this point. And what you'll see is that Pericles takes this opportunity to pay tribute to the soldiers, not by talking about the soldiers themselves, but by talking about the city, the polis they were fighting for, namely Athens. And he goes into this sort of long account of what makes Athens a superior polis to Sparta. May not be immediately obvious what he is doing, but that is what he is doing. He doesn't mention the name Sparta, I don't think even once. He does at one point talk about the Lacedaemonians, and that's just another name for the Spartans. So there's no question about it. He's talking about the Spartans, even though he's usually just using pronouns, they, them, and so on. So you need to be aware right away that one of your discussion questions for the week, we're having a discussion forum this week, and one of your discussion questions has to do with this. The discussion question is going to ask you to talk about one of the reasons that Pericles gives for why Athens is a superior polis to Sparta. So be reading for that. The next part of the text comes from Book 3, and it's shorter, but it's in some ways more difficult because it's hard to understand what exactly is going on and what Thucydides is describing. So let me give you just a little bit of background here. Okay, the war has been going on for several years at this point. And what's happening, he's describing what's happening all throughout Greece. And that is, in almost every Greek polis, there is tension or even out and out sort of warfare between the pro-Athens faction and the pro-Spartan faction. Each group is trying to gain power in its polis and drive the other group out. And I want you to notice what Thucydides is doing in this section. I think sometimes we think that the job of historians is simply to give facts, provide facts, and not really make any judgments. Well, the fact of the matter is that pretty much all historians are not just giving facts, but also making judgments. And that's certainly true of what Thucydides is doing here. He is not just telling us what's happening in the cities of Greece. He's trying to interpret what's happening. And he's trying to make a statement about what war does and what war does specifically to language. In times of war, we start to use language differently. And for Thucydides, this is not a good thing at all, because according to him anyway, what's happening is that people are abusing language. And so read that section with those considerations in mind. And by the way, this is a great example of the kind of universal significance that Thucydides thinks his account has. Because in a way, what he's saying is, look, if you find yourself in a war, if your nation is at war, beware of how people are going to start speaking. People will start using language in ways that are very unhealthy. All right, well, this brings us to the final section of the Thucydides reading, which is in some ways the most gripping. It is a description of a conference that takes place at Melos. Melos is one of the Greek Aegean islands. You can find it on the map that I gave you right near the crease there, just on the left-hand side of the crease. Small, relatively insignificant island, but Melos was a colony of Sparta. Okay, it was originally founded by Spartans. And it gave Sparta a kind of nominal, small amount of tribute toward the war effort. Despite that, however, Melos wanted to be Switzerland. They wanted to be neutral. We're not for Sparta. We're not for Athens. You guys go fight your war somewhere else. Leave us alone. We're just going to raise crops and stay out of it. But Athens will not accept this. Athens doesn't believe in neutrality because Athens believes that if you're not for us, you are against us. So what Thucydides is describing here is a conference that takes place between the leaders of the Athenians and the leaders of the people of Melos, discussing sort of what happens next. The leaders of the Melos trying to insist that they can remain neutral, that they ought to be left alone, with the Athenians arguing to the contrary, no, there is no such thing as neutrality here. You're either for us or against us, and if you're not for us, we're going to make you pay. So this leads me to the next discussion question for this week, which is based on this part of the reading. Okay. And the discussion question says, okay, look, on the one hand, Thucydides is trying to give us an account of the Peloponnesian War that is factual, that is reliable, that is not simply propaganda for one side or another. But the fact of the matter is he's writing about a war that he himself was involved with. He was an Athenian general at one point, but then he was exiled by the Athenians for failing to save a Greek city. So this is not somebody who is a perfectly neutral, detached observer. So bearing all that in mind, the discussion question is, what kind of portrayal do you think he is trying to give of the Athenians? Do you, in this conference at Melos, do you detect a kind of pro-Athens angle? I mean, again, he is an Athenian himself. He had fought for the Athenians. Or do you detect a kind of critique of the Athenians here? And of course, he's writing from exile. He is been banished from Athens, so perhaps he's trying to offer a criticism. So read that account of the conference at Melos with that discussion question in mind. All right, well, very quickly, the outcome of the war. The outcome of the war is that Athens loses. Sparta wins the war without question, and Athens will never sort of regain the military supremacy that it once enjoyed. And it was a demographic disaster for Athens as well. I mean, about half of all Athenian men died during the course of the war. So this is a true catastrophe for Athens. So they unconditionally surrender to the Spartans in 404. The empire that they had amassed in the Aegean region would be no more. So what happens over the course of the next 60 years? Well, we have a kind of stalemate. Athens is still a force to be reckoned with, even though it's a shadow of its former self. Sparta, of course, continues to be a leading polis. The polis of Thebes is also quite ambitious and is sort of vying for supremacy. So what you have over the next 60 years is profound disunity among the Greeks. The Greek police are almost constantly at war with one another. There's just no unity among the Greeks, despite the fact that they shared the same language, the same culture, the same religion. They're never able to find political unity. And this is really going to come to haunt the Greeks, because later in the 4th century, a neighboring nation will take advantage of this Greek disunity. That neighboring nation is the Macedonians. And we're going to pick up on that story in a couple of weeks. But until then, for the next 2 weeks at least, we're going to be looking at some of the great art and literature that was produced by the Greeks during this time. See you then.